What would you do when the person who shares your DNA, who looked exactly like you from the moment you took your first breath, decides to shatter everything you hold sacred for a handful of dirty money? How far does greed push someone before they completely sever the ties of blood? And when your family's foundation is built on millions, is every kind word, every shared memory, just another calculated lie? Welcome back to Behind Closed Doors, where we peel back the polished veneers of the elite to expose the rot beneath. If you're looking for the brutal truth about family, betrayal, and the legal maneuvers that decide everything, you're in the right place. Don't let the next devastating secret slip through your fingers. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell notification so you're the first to know when the next chapter drops. Trust me, you won't want to miss the fallout. Chapter 1. The Opening Fist. The Childhood Home Sold for a Song. The scent of salt water and old money used to be the smell of safety. Now, it's the stench of betrayal. I stood on the manicured lawn of the estate, the Pacific breeze whipping my silk scarf, watching the for sale sign, the sold sign, mock me. It wasn't just a house. It was the fortress where my father, the legendary Alexander Thorne, built his empire and raised his twin daughters. But now, the sale was finalized, and the fortress was gone. Just like that. It's a magnificent view, isn't it, Cassandra? I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. That voice, that slick, velvet-covered malice, belonged only to her. Veronica. My mirror image, my twin sister, the architect of this demolition. You really came, I finally said, my voice low, a razor barely scraping the skin. I thought you'd send one of your pathetic PAs to gloat. She stepped beside me. Immaculate in a custom Chanel suit that probably cost more than the down payment on a decent condo. She smiled, a smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating blue eyes. Why would I miss this? The closing of a chapter. A lucrative one, at that. A month. Only 30 days had passed since the accident that put our father into a medically induced coma. 30 days since the patriarch of Thorne Industries, the man who knew the value of every single asset down to the last antique spoon, was reduced to a ventilator and a flat EEG line. And in those 30 days, Veronica, armed with a special power of attorney, POA, signed, of course, before the tragedy, when we were all so blissfully ignorant, had moved with the predatory speed of a shark smelling blood. The house is appraised at $20 million, Ronnie. You sold it for 12. My hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of my trench coat. I looked at the shimmering blue of the infinity pool, remembering her 9th birthday party where she'd pushed me in, ruining my new dress just for sport. She always played to win, and she didn't care who she drowned in the process. Liquidity, Cassie. It's what Father always preached. Assets are only assets when they're fungible. And frankly, this place was a sentimental albatross. I needed the cash flow for my ventures. She made ventures sound like a charity initiative. We both knew it meant funding her new, highly speculative tech startup that Dad had explicitly forbidden her from dumping company funds into. Sentiment. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. For me, this house was the only tangible link left to our childhood, to the idea of a functional family before the money poisoned us. For her, it was a heavy anchor she needed to jettison to fuel her frantic, shallow ambition. She looked at the sprawling mansion, not with affection, but with the cold, detached gaze of a corporate auditor reviewing a non-performing asset. The POA was for his medical care, Veronica, not a fire sale of core family assets, I challenged, turning my full attention to her. I needed her to see the conviction in my eyes, even if the law was currently on her side. She laughed, a dry, sophisticated sound that did not touch the soul. It was comprehensive, dear sister. I consulted 3 different legal teams. Dad granted me the full authority to manage his affairs in his absence or incapacity. A coma is the very definition of incapacity. Try again, Cassandra. You're clutching at straws. She was right. Legally, she was watertight. That was the sickening brilliance of her move. She hadn't broken the law. She had exploited a legal loophole with surgical precision, leveraging our father's momentary vulnerability. The proceeds, a cool $12 million, were already sitting in a private account, far from the clutches of the estate or, more importantly, from me. I took a deep, steadying breath. The salt in the air burned my lungs. I remembered the exact moment, nearly a year ago, when Father and I sat in his study, overlooking this very lawn. He was signing papers, reorganizing his estate, a grim expression on his face. He looked up at me, his eyes tired but sharp. "Cassie," he'd said, leaning forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Veronica's ambition. It will be her downfall, and potentially ours. I need to protect the company, protect you, protect what's right. We need a safety net, a long rope with a very tight knot." He had foreseen this. He hadn't just worried about her greed. He had anticipated it. He knew that the only way to stop a predator was to set a sophisticated trap. "Enjoy your $12 million, Ronnie," I said, finally allowing a small, knowing smile to touch my lips. It was a smile she hadn't expected. It broke her perfect composure for a split second. She saw something in my eyes she couldn't immediately decipher, and the uncertainty was a drug to me. "Is that a threat, dear? I thought you were supposed to be the sensible one, the emotional one," she sneered, recovering quickly, though her tone was suddenly tighter. "No threat, just a statement of fact," I replied, the drama of the moment perfectly captured in the short, sharp clarity of my words. "You have the right to sell the house. That much is true. But the legal documents you think protect you, they are, shall we say, a little outdated. The POA gave you the authority to sell property, yes. It did not give you the authority to keep the money." Her flawless jaw tightened. "What are you talking about? It goes into his estate." "It would have," I corrected, enjoying the slow burn of confusion in her eyes. "If the inheritance structure hadn't been quietly, very privately, updated 10 months ago. You've just triggered a clause, Veronica. A magnificent, self-detonating legal mechanism that Father and I designed specifically for this moment. It's a very tight knot, Ronnie. A legal noose. And you just placed your own neck in the noose and kicked the chair out from under you." I turned my back on her, walking toward the gate. The sea air felt cleaner now. I could hear her calling my name, the panic finally starting to crack her icy facade. But I didn't stop. I had my piece of paper, a document far more powerful than her temporary POA. My father hadn't just feared her, he had prepared for her. He taught me that in this family, the game isn't won by the most aggressive player, but by the one who understands the rules of law best. And the game, Veronica, had just begun. I could still smell the fresh paint on the newly installed sold sign, but the scent of imminent justice was infinitely sweeter. The foundation of her empire had just been laid on quicksand. Of course, the trap has been set. Now we proceed to Chapter 2, where the antagonist realizes the full extent of her predicament, and the protagonist reveals the brilliant, cold-blooded legal strategy that underpins the entire revenge plot. Chapter 2, The Adversary and the Codicil's Secret. Veronica's screech was a familiar, high-pitched thing, the sound of her entitlement hitting a roadblock. It was almost a comfort. As I walked away from the house, the scent of fresh ocean air mixed with the residual, almost metallic tang of her fury. She's panicked. I felt the adrenaline spike, clean and sharp. This wasn't about the $12 million she'd pocketed from the quick sale. That was just pocket change to the Thorne family. This was about control. And I had just proven, in one sharp sentence, that her control was an illusion, a paper-thin facade waiting for the right legal draft to shred it. I got into my sedan, a discreet jet-black German tank, deliberately unremarkable, and glanced at my phone. 2 missed calls from her managing partner and a text from Veronica herself. "What in God's name did you do, Cassandra?" I didn't reply. Silence is power. It forces the enemy to fill the void with their own fear, their own worst-case scenarios. And I knew exactly what her worst-case scenario was: to be utterly dependent on my father's goodwill, a goodwill she had just systematically annihilated. My destination wasn't the law firm, not yet. It was the hospital, the high-security wing where Alexander Thorne lay, his life maintained by a symphony of beeping machines. I wore a surgical mask and scrubs, easily blending into the crowd of hyper-efficient medical staff. I needed to see him, not because I thought he'd wake up today, but because I needed the moral dichotomy of the room to reinforce my resolve. He looked small in the bed, the titan of industry reduced to a fragile shell. "This is why, Dad. This is why we did this." I pulled a chair close, my voice barely a whisper. "Ronnie is moving fast. She's already cut off my access to your personal physician, Dr. Chen. She's spreading the gospel. Alexander will never wake up. The POA is mine, and the company is next." I knew she was doing it. She was laying the groundwork for a court petition. Formal declaration of incapacity, followed by the permanent appointment of herself as conservator of the entire Thorne estate. If she succeeded, the $12 million was just the beginning. She'd gut the company, drain the trusts, and leave me with scraps. But we planned for this, didn't we? My hand went instinctively to the inside pocket of my coat, touching the thick, reassuring quality of the official document. It wasn't the POA she held, nor the old will she knew about. It was the codicil. "Remember the phrase, Dad, the moral turpitude clause." I closed my eyes, recalling the year of clandestine meetings with his most trusted and discreetly retired legal counsel. It started after Veronica tried to embezzle a 6-figure sum by falsifying expense reports. Dad caught it. He didn't press charges. He just got cold. That was when he started constructing the cage. He changed his entire estate plan, shifting the assets from the will into a massive revocable trust. The language was dense, intentionally opaque to anyone who didn't write it. But the crux, the Chekhov's gun, was the addendum we drafted. The conversation replayed in my head, a perfectly rendered internal monologue. "I want the language to be unambiguous, counsel. A single, clear tripwire," Dad had instructed. The lawyer, a granite-faced woman named Mrs. Petrov, had nodded. "It must be tied to a specific action, Mr. Thorne. Something beyond simple management error. Something that shows a fundamental, disqualifying betrayal of trust." And that's what they drafted. Not just a standard disinheritance clause. It was a masterpiece of legal malice. It tied the continuance of her inheritance, and crucially, her right to any existing administrative power, to her absolute good faith toward the core assets. Specifically, it stated, any attempt by a named beneficiary to liquidate, encumber, or materially diminish the value of a core asset of the trust, while the settlor, Alexander Thorne, is in a state of clinical incapacitation, for the sole purpose of personal immediate financial gain, unrelated to the settler's care or the ongoing legitimate operations of Thorne Industries, shall be deemed an act of moral turpitude against the settler's expressed wishes, resulting in the immediate and permanent forfeiture of all beneficial interests under this trust, and the mandatory revocation of any pre-existing power of attorney granted by the settler. That's the thong long, the noose. The house, listed under the trust since last year, was explicitly designated a core asset. Selling it for $12 million when it was worth $20 million, a clear $8 million diminution of value, to fund her private unrelated startup, that screamed personal, immediate financial gain, louder than any Wall Street protest. I leaned closer to Dad, pulling the sheet up slightly. "The $12 million is still in escrow, Dad. She thinks she's safe. She thinks the POA is her shield, but that shield is about to turn into a legal boomerang. The door to the room creaked open slightly. Veronica, her face tight with a desperate, ill-concealed agitation, peered in. She was supposed to be at a meeting with her investment bankers. She saw me, sitting there quietly, intimately close to the unconscious source of all power, and her eyes narrowed. "Get out, Cassandra," she hissed, striding toward me. Her voice was sharp, but there was a tremor in her hand as she reached for the ventilator's controls, a purely dominant, territorial gesture. "I have just as much right to be here as you do, Veronica." "No, you don't. I'm the designated healthcare proxy," she snapped, "and I'm the one managing his assets now. You're just the little sister who cried over a house. The house is sold. Get over it. You lost." I stood up, meeting her glare. Our faces were identical, yet the gulf between our souls was wider than the Pacific outside the home she'd just traded away. This was it, the moment I made the progressive complication real. "I lost the house, yes," I agreed calmly, making her pause. "But you lost something far more valuable. You lost the right to anything else. You lost the right to the POA you're brandishing. You lost your entire inheritance." "You're hysterical. The lawyer verified the POA is valid." She threw her hands up, the high-stakes pressure finally cracking her veneer of cool sophistication. "It was valid," I whispered, the dramatic language hanging heavy in the sterile air. "Until the moment you signed that sales agreement. That action, Veronica, automatically triggered the revocation clause in the Thorne Family Trust codicil. You self-destructed. You activated the noose. The house was the bait, and your greed was the trigger. You're not managing his assets. As of yesterday, you have absolutely no legal standing here. You are a trespasser." The color drained from her face. She saw it then. The calm, meticulous confidence in my eyes that spoke volumes louder than her panic shouting. I hadn't been crying over a house. I had been setting a trap. A brilliant, intricate trap designed by the greatest legal mind in the family, my father, and executed by the daughter she always underestimated. I stepped around her, placing my hand firmly on the door handle. "Enjoy your meeting with the investment bankers, Veronica. I suggest you tell them the $12 million you promised them is legally tainted. Because tomorrow, when I file the petition for declaration of breach of fiduciary duty and the codicil with the court, your entire financial world is going to freeze solid." I walked out, leaving her alone in the silent room, staring at the motionless figure of our father. The silence behind me was no longer calm. It was the sound of a viper realizing it was caught, its own venom trapped inside a collapsing glass cage. The setup was complete. Now, for the courtroom drama. Chapter 3. Publicizing the sale and the empty warning. I left Veronica standing in that sterile room, her composure finally shattered, staring down the man she'd tried to bury. The walk back to my car felt like a victory lap, slow and deliberate. I knew her next move, panic. She'd call her lawyers, her investment banking cronies, and anyone else who could possibly make this problem disappear. But the problem wasn't a PR nightmare. It was a paper trail, and paper trails, especially those sealed by my father's signature and Mrs. Petrov's iron will. Don't just vanish. Panic is a magnificent weapon. It makes calculated people impulsive, and impulse is where they make the fatal mistakes. The following morning was a carefully managed chaos. I initiated the legal proceedings first thing. The documents were filed, a petition for temporary restraining order, TRO, on the sale proceeds, and a motion to present the codicil to the court for validation. It was procedural, boring work, but the stakes made every typed word feel like a gunshot. Then the main event. Veronica's hastily called family update meeting at the main offices of Thorne Industries. She had planned this as her coronation, a chance to parade the $12 million liquidity injection and assert her dominance over the remaining family shareholders, mostly distant cousins and old board members who cared more about dividends than decency. The conference room was all polished mahogany and high-backed leather chairs. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and even more expensive fear. Veronica stood at the head of the table, flanked by her smarmy young corporate lawyer, a man who looked like he believed everything he saw on CNBC. She started with a practiced confidence, ignoring my presence at the far end of the table. "Good morning, everyone. I know many of you are concerned about Alexander's condition. I want to assure you, as his sole legally appointed agent, that the business is secure." Her eyes flashed to mine, daring me to interrupt. "The real estate asset in Pacific Heights, as you know, has been cumbersome. It was a drain. I exercised my fiduciary duty under the durable power of attorney to liquidate it immediately." She clicked a slide, a rendering of the old estate, stamped with a red "sold." Beside it, a triumphant graphic, $12,000 liquidity injection. A cousin, old Mr. Finch, cleared his throat. 12 million seems aggressive, Veronica. It was valued significantly higher. The market is volatile. Robert, she lied smoothly. This was a strategic, fast-paced transaction to secure capital for Thorne Innovations, my new division, which, by the way, will bring us into the next decade. She was publicly announcing her intent, taking the family money and sinking it into her personal vanity project. It was the purest form of betrayal, done right in front of the portraits of our ancestors. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the marble floor. Every head snapped toward me. The power of silence was over. "A strategic transaction for your division. Veronica?" I asked, standing up slowly. I walked toward the projector screen, my shadow falling over the triumphant graphic. "Or an act of self-dealing done while the grantor of your authority lay unconscious?" Her lawyer immediately jumped in. "Miss Thorne, your sister has no standing here. She is not an officer of the company, and the sale was conducted well within the parameters of the POA." "Sit down, Mr. Grant," I instructed, using the cold, authoritative tone I learned from Father. He hesitated, looking at Veronica, who was staring at me with pure venom. "I have no standing in the company. That's true," I conceded. I turned to the table, adopting the intimate, confessional tone I knew would cut through the corporate jargon. "But I do have standing as a primary beneficiary of the Thorne Family Trust, a trust that holds 90% of all liquid assets and, crucially, all real property, including the house you just sold." I looked directly at Veronica, keeping my voice low and steady. "You have the right to sell it. The POA gave you that operational right. But that sale has consequences you didn't read in the fine print, Veronica. Consequences that void the very instrument you used to sell it." She finally spoke, her voice laced with forced mockery. "Oh, here we go. The sentimental sister found a dusty old ledger. What are you going to do, Cassandra? Sue me for being fiscally responsible? I did my duty. The money is mine to manage under the POA. Prove otherwise." She was playing to the audience, the shareholders, trying to paint me as the hysterical, emotional twin. I loved it. I was ready to deliver the gut punch. "I won't sue you for fiscal responsibility, Ronnie. I'm going to sue you for forfeiture." I took out my phone and placed it on the table. It contained a PDF, a legally notarized copy of the codicil. I tapped a few times and read aloud, my voice clear and deliberate, the language intentionally blunt and legalistic. Section 4B, titled Moral Contingency Clause, of the Trust Codicil dated 10 months ago states, "Any attempt by a named beneficiary to liquidate, encumber, or materially diminish the value of a core asset, while the settlor, Alexander Thorne, is in a state of clinical incapacitation for the sole purpose of personal, immediate financial gain unrelated to the settlor's care, shall be deemed an act of moral turpitude against the settlor's expressed wishes, resulting in the immediate and permanent forfeiture of all beneficial interests under this trust." A collective sharp intake of breath echoed around the table. The words "immediate and permanent forfeiture" landed like heavy stones. Veronica's mocking smile froze. Her lawyer, Mr. Grant, was now staring at his own phone, rapidly Googling the trust's filing number. The house, I continued, pointing back at the projector, the asset you just sold for a song against its true market value, to finance your private Thorn innovations, is explicitly listed as a core asset in Schedule A of this codicil. I met her eyes. She was breathing fast now, her chest rising and falling visibly. You had the right to sell it, Ronnie, but you do not have the right to keep the money, and you certainly do not have the right to manage anything else, because the sale of that asset, under those terms, was the exact action Father designated as a disqualifying betrayal. You signed the sales contract, and you simultaneously disinherited yourself. I paused, letting the crushing weight of the revelation sink in for everyone present. The high-stakes drama was real, palpable. You have the 12 million, Veronica, I finished, picking up my phone and walking toward the door. But you have forfeited your $200 million legacy, your seat on the board, and the validity of your POA. Enjoy the liquidity. It's the only Thorn money you'll ever legally touch again. Her face was white, utterly stripped of arrogance. You set me up. This is fraud. No, Ronnie, I said, opening the door. This is a legal consequence. This is Father's justice. And tomorrow we'll see whose paperwork holds up in court. I left the conference room and the stunned silence behind me. The noose was tightening. Her move was public. My countermove was now public record. I could feel the legal satisfaction welling up, the thrill of watching the predator fall into a trap they never saw coming. Chapter 4. The Legal Climax. Activating the Moral Clause. The courthouse air was dry, recycled, and heavy with human anxiety. It was the perfect stage for corporate bloodsport. This wasn't a criminal trial. It was a civil battle for the soul and the entire fortune of Alexander Thorn. The hearing was swift, focused solely on my motion to validate the codicil and implement the temporary restraining order, TRO, on the sale proceeds. I sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by Mrs. Petroff, my father's grizzled, hyper-competent former counsel, who carried herself like a walking constitutional amendment. Across the room, Veronica was a picture of controlled fury. She wore a power suit the color of a fresh bruise, but the tremor in her hands, barely perceptible, told the real story. Her lawyer, Mr. Grant, kept shooting me venomous glances, trying to recover from the public humiliation I'd dealt him the day before. The judge, Justice Helen Richter, known for her sharp mind and absolute intolerance for nonsense, cut straight to the chase. Ms. Thorn, Veronica, your counsel has filed a counter-motion claiming that the codicil presented by the petitioner, Cassandra Thorn, is invalid, alleging it was signed under duress or undue influence, given your father's failing health at the time. Is that correct, Mr. Grant? Mr. Grant, straightening his tie, jumped to his feet. Yes, Your Honor. The document in question, this supposed codicil, drastically alters the established distribution framework. It was executed only 10 months ago, a period during which Mr. Thorn was frequently ill and emotionally vulnerable. Furthermore, the clause regarding moral turpitude is vague, punitive, and clearly designed to exclude my client, who was acting in the best financial interest of the estate under a valid, durable power of attorney. He was good. He was painting me as the opportunist, twisting the truth into a story of the good twin preying on our sick father. Justice Richter looked at me. Ms. Thorn, Cassandra, your rebuttal? I stood up. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to be surgically precise. Your Honor, the codicil's validity is a matter of record. It was signed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses and notarized. Regarding the timing, my father was in perfect cognitive health when he signed it, a fact we can easily establish with medical records from that period. However, we are not here to discuss his competency then. We are here to discuss my sister's action now. I walked toward the lectern, placing the two key documents side by side, Veronica's POA and the codicil. The symbolism was everything. My sister claimed she was acting in the best financial interest of the estate by selling the Pacific Heights home, a core asset, for $8 million under appraisal. She claims the $12 million was needed for liquidity for a private corporate venture. I paused, letting the irony sink in. The midpoint twist. This was the linchpin. Your Honor, the moral turpitude clause is not vague. It is exquisitely specific. It was designed to prevent exactly this scenario: a beneficiary exploiting the settler's incapacitation to enrich themselves at the expense of the trust's long-term stability. I looked directly at Veronica. Her breath hitched. Justice Richter, my sister's power of attorney was valid. She had the right to sell the house. I conceded that. But the fatal flaw in her entire scheme is this: the POA was granted by Alexander Thorne, who, as the settlor, explicitly reserved the right to unilaterally revoke it within the trust codicil. The courtroom went dead silent. Legal eyes widened. Mr. Grant looked like someone had just pulled the chair out from under him, just as I'd warned Veronica. The codicil states that any act of moral turpitude immediately and permanently triggers the revocation of all beneficial interests. And I draw your attention to the next phrase, Your Honor, and the mandatory revocation of any pre-existing power of attorney granted by the settlor. I pointed to the document. Legal plausibility. The father who granted the POA was the same man who wrote the trust that could take it away. He used one hand to give power, and the other to tie the termination clause to a moral condition. My sister signed the sales agreement for the house at a deeply discounted price, intending to divert the funds to her private business. That single, self-serving action automatically and instantaneously met the criteria for moral turpitude as defined by the codicil. I looked up at Justice Richter, who was reading the clause intently. In simple terms, Your Honor, the moment she executed the sales contract, her power of attorney was null and void by the terms of the superior document, the trust. She did not just disinherit herself. She stripped herself of all legal authority over my father's life and finances at the very second she signed that deed. I leaned back, delivering the final crushing sentence. She wasn't just acting outside her authority. She was acting without any authority. The POA self-terminated, rendering her control over the sale proceeds and her role as health proxy entirely illegitimate. Justice Richter put down the document. She looked at Veronica, whose face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Mr. Grant was desperately whispering to her, but she barely seemed to hear him. The truth was too heavy, too complete. Mr. Grant, the judge said, her voice devoid of inflection. Your client seems to have hoisted herself on her own petard, so to speak. The clause is specific, and the transaction is documented. The court finds the grounds for an immediate review compelling. I am issuing a court order freezing all proceeds from the Pacific Heights sale, effective immediately. Furthermore, Ms. Thorne, Veronica, your current status as power of attorney is placed under immediate judicial review, pending evidence in the next hearing. The court views the liquidation of a core asset for personal gain, while the settlor is incapacitated as a potential breach of fiduciary duty. The hammer fell, not literally, but legally. Veronica had lost the money, lost the house, and worst of all, lost the one thing she craved: her legal, unquestioned power. I felt a surge of cold, satisfying triumph. She had thought the POA was her crown. It was, in fact, the key that unlocked her prison. This wasn't revenge. This was surgical justice. Qua trin tu tung ja bat jiao, chuong for jen huan thant palat keo pap li jiao tien. Bai gio le lus ke thuch viex tuoch quien va jua ra beng chung kong the choi kai. Chapter 5. Reclamation and the Recorded Truth. Veronica's mask finally cracked. When Justice Richter issued the court order, my twin didn't just look defeated. She looked utterly incandescent, with rage and disbelief. Her lawyer, Mr. Grant, immediately called for a recess, trying to contain the damage, but the damage was irreversible. I saw the whispers between them, sharp, frantic, and ultimately useless. I walked out of the courtroom with Mrs. Petrov, who gave me the smallest, most significant nod. Clean, Cassandra. Textbook execution of a testamentary condition subsequent. Your father would be proud. Proud. That was the currency I truly craved. Not the money, but the validation of my calculated restraint against her reckless avarice. The next hearing was set for the following day. The formal motion to install an independent temporary conservator, effectively boxing Veronica out completely, and the presentation of all evidence. Veronica's strategy was obvious: deny everything. When we returned to the courtroom, Mr. Grant came out swinging. Your Honor, the petitioner's entire case rests on an unverified document, this codicil. We contend that the document is a fabrication, or at best, an old draft, signed under circumstances of extreme duress or without the settler's full comprehension. My client, Veronica Thorne, maintains that her father never intended to include such a draconian, self-destructing clause. This codicil should be thrown out as an attempt by the petitioner to commit inheritance tampering. He was trying to flip the script, turning the victim into the villain. Veronica sat beside him, projecting an image of righteous indignation, her blue eyes colder and harder than I'd ever seen them. Justice Richter looked skeptical. Mr. Grant, the document bears all the requisite legal markings and notarizations. Do you have material evidence that the settler lacked capacity at the time of signing? We are assembling that evidence, Your Honor. However, the burden is on the petitioner to prove the intent behind this specific, morally charged clause. Why would a father create such a poison pill for his own daughter? It defies all logic and familial affection. It defies your logic, Grant. It adheres perfectly to ours. This was my moment for the Chekhov's gun. I rose, gripping the small leather-bound folder that contained the digital file. Your Honor, the intent is perfectly clear. It was a measure of final protection, a recognition that the bond of trust between my father and my sister had become irrevocably damaged. And I do not need circumstantial evidence to prove my father's intent. I have his voice. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. Veronica's face went pale for the second time in 24 hours. I request permission to play an audio recording, Your Honor. This is a recording made on a secure device during the exact meeting when the codicil was signed 10 months ago. It captures the entire conversation between my father, his counsel, and myself, explicitly detailing the reason for the moral turpitude clause. Mr. Grant shot up, shouting, "Objection! Hearsay! This is inadmissible!" Your Honor, I countered immediately, this is not hearsay. This is a direct recording of the settler's state of mind, intent, and instruction regarding the trust, made during the execution of the instrument. It goes directly to the heart of the undue influence claim they have just raised. Justice Richter considered this for a moment. The objection is overruled. Play the recording, Miss Thorne, but this had better be relevant. I placed the speaker on the table and pressed play. The crackle of an old recording device filled the room, followed by the familiar resonant voice of my father, Alexander Thorne, sharp and commanding. Mrs. Petrov, I need the language to be unequivocal. If Veronica, at any point after I am incapacitated, tries to sell a core asset, like the house, at an opportunistic price, say, 8 figures below market value, to finance her vanity projects, I want her out, immediately, no quarter. Then the calm, professional voice of Mrs. Petrov. Mr. Thorne, for clarity, you see such an act as a fundamental breach of trust, a moral turpitude? Precisely, my father confirmed, his voice iron hard. It's not a financial mistake. It's a character flaw. It's theft against the legacy I built. If she proves she's willing to sacrifice the family home for a quick personal gain, she has proven she is unfit to manage anything else. The POA is revoked, the inheritance is gone. It is a line she must not cross. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was monumental. It wasn't just a voice, it was the final devastating word of the patriarch. I let the recording hang in the air for a perfect, agonizing 10 seconds. I didn't need to look at Veronica. I could feel her unraveling. Her entire defense, that the clause was a vindictive accident, had been blown apart by the sound of her own father's cold, deliberate judgment. I broke the silence. Your Honor, the recording proves two things. First, that my father was of sound mind, and second, that he intentionally created this specific legal mechanism to police my sister's documented history of financial self-interest. Mr. Grant was slumped in his chair, defeated. Justice Richter looked at Veronica, her expression stern. Ms. Thorne, the court finds that the codicil is valid and the conditions for forfeiture were clearly and intentionally set by the settler. Your recorded act of selling the Pacific Heights property for self-enrichment while your father was in a coma constitutes the very act of moral turpitude described. Consequently, the court validates the revocation of your beneficial interest in the trust, and most importantly, the immediate and permanent revocation of your durable power of attorney. Furthermore, the judge continued, given the egregious nature of the breach of fiduciary duty revealed by this evidence, the court is immediately ordering the permanent freeze of the $12 million, and I am appointing an independent third party as the temporary conservator of Alexander Thorne's estate and his personal care decisions. Ms. Veronica Thorne is to have no further contact with the settler or the financial instruments of the estate. Veronica leaped to her feet, her composure finally dissolving into a raw scream. This is not over, Cassandra! You manipulative bitch! You did this! She was dragged away by the bailiff, her expensive suit and perfect hair finally losing the battle against her uncontrollable, exposed fury. The power fantasy was complete. The predator was disarmed, stripped of all authority, not by physical force, but by the quiet, meticulous power of the law. I watched her go, not with triumph, but with a cold, hollow satisfaction. Justice was done, but at what cost? Yifrin stared. Chapter 6. The Awakening and the Accident's Truth. The silence in the days following the court order was unnerving. Veronica had vanished, likely holed up with a rotating cast of expensive, increasingly desperate lawyers trying to petition against Justice Richter's ruling. But the legal noose was knotted tight, the money was frozen, the POA revoked, and the family fortress was safe. It was a victory measured in paper and ink, but the satisfaction felt brittle. The man who truly mattered, my father, was still lost to us. I visited him late that afternoon, the hospital room quieter than usual. The temporary conservator, a kindly but detached woman named Ms. Davies, had already ensured Dr. Chen, Veronica's hand-picked physician, was replaced with an independent neurological team. The air was cleaner, the machines less frantic. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, now free of Veronica's dominating, possessive touch. We did it, Dad, I murmured, my voice heavy with exhaustion. We saved the house, we froze the funds, and Veronica has no legal power left. She couldn't handle the truth of the codicil. She thought she was smarter than you. I was detailing the court drama, the frozen accounts, the sound of his own voice delivering the verdict, as a sort of ritual, a one-sided conversation meant to bring closure to my own frantic weeks. Suddenly, his hand, the one I was holding, squeezed mine. My breath hitched. My heart slammed against my ribs. I thought it was a spasm, a machine hiccup, anything but that. I leaned in, my voice shaking. Dad, did you hear me? Can you squeeze again? He squeezed again, gentle but definite. I shot out of the chair, hitting the emergency call button with a shaking hand. Within seconds, the new neurological team swarmed the room. Minutes stretched into hours of frantic testing, hushed medical jargon, and escalating hope. He was emerging. Not a sudden dramatic awakening, but a slow, agonizing crawl back to consciousness. The next morning, the tubes were coming out. He was able to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, but undeniably him. When I was finally allowed back in, he was propped up on pillows, his eyes, tired, bloodshot, but perfectly clear, focused solely on me. Ms. Davies stood by, ensuring no undue stress. "Cassie," he rasped, his eyes filling with tears that finally spilled over. "The house." "It's safe, Dad. The money's frozen. Veronica has nothing. You won." "Your codicil was brilliant." I held his hand tightly, relief washing over me so intensely it felt like pain. He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the monumental scale of the victory. Then, his eyes snapped open again, and the weariness was replaced by an old familiar intensity, the look of a man about to deliver a verdict. "Veronica, where is she?" "Disgraced, Dad, legally defeated. The court revoked her POA for breach of fiduciary duty." He shook his head slowly, painfully. "No, Cassie, that's not the whole truth." He struggled to push himself higher, his frustration palpable. I lowered the bed and leaned closer. This was the climax of emotion, the moment the family tragedy deepened into a true crime. "Listen to me," he whispered, his voice gaining a strained urgency. "The accident, it wasn't just a car crash." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, heavier than any legal fear. "What do you mean, Dad? The police report said slick roads, mechanical failure." "The mechanic. He was on her payroll." The air left my lungs, melodrama, conspiracy. But his eyes, they held only the terrifying truth. 2 weeks before the crash, he continued, his voice barely a breath, "I changed the CEO succession plan. Not to me, not to Veronica, to an external executive. She found out. She called me, screaming, said she deserved it all, said I was leaving her with nothing but a worthless company." He looked at my face, ensuring I understood the magnitude of his statement. "The accident wasn't random, Cassie. It was deliberate. She had the brakes tampered with. She wanted to make me incapacitated, to take control while I was alive before the new succession papers were finalized. The betrayal was not just financial. It was existential. She hadn't just stolen the house. She had tried to steal his life and the company using his coma as cover. She tried to kill you? My voice was a thin, disbelieving squeak. No, she needed me incapacitated, in a coma, alive enough for her POA to be valid, but silent enough so I couldn't stop her. If I had died, the will would have triggered, and the trust would have immediately taken over. The coma was her perfect loophole, a living death. The sheer, chilling brilliance of her plan was breathtaking. She hadn't just acted on greed, she had acted on a deep pathological calculation. She had chosen the one condition, incapacitation, that gave her ultimate legal power without triggering the finality of the will. "You have to tell the authorities, Dad. We have to call the police." "No," he insisted, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "Not yet. She's smart. She's covered her tracks. She thought the coma would last forever. But now she knows I'm awake. She knows what I know. She'll run or she'll try to silence me permanently. I need one last thing, Cassie. We need to lure her out, to finish this face to face. I want her to see my face when I deliver the final judgment." His hand released mine. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a loving father, but of a vengeful judge. The legal trap was sprung, but the familial, titigi, mortal trap, the high-stakes finale, had just been set. The battle for the money was over. The fight for his life and her freedom had just begun. Dien bien jan len jen jin jiam kain han va pap li. Chuang 6 jin tiet lo amu. Bai gio, moi tu fai juoch giai quiet. Trong chuang 7. Joy jiao quoi chung va bat giu. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation and the Arrest. The air in the hospital room was thick with a new kind of tension. Not the sterile fear of illness, but the volatile energy of a coming storm. My father, Alexander Thorne, was not just awake. He was actively preparing for war. His strength was returning, fueled entirely by a burning need for final justice. "She's expecting me to file a police report," he rasped, the ventilator's remnant dryness still clinging to his throat. He dismissed Ms. Davies and the nurse with a curt wave, asserting his old dominance. "That's what the weak do. We, Cassandra, are going to do better." "Luring her out is too risky, Dad. She's desperate. She knows you can place her at the scene of an attempted murder," I argued, my voice tight. The legal revenge was clean, but this felt dirty, personal, and profoundly dangerous. He looked at me, a glimmer of the ruthless tycoon back in his eyes. "Exactly. She knows I'm the only loose end that matters. She'll come for me, but she won't come for my life this time. She'll come for the evidence." His plan was simple, brutal, and utterly calculated. He used my own phone to send a text to Veronica's private number, the one I hadn't used since the court injunction. "They found the mechanic. He's talking. The full confession is on a USB drive hidden in the old study desk. Tonight." It was a lie, a digital phantom lure. But it contained just enough terrifying truth, the existence of a mechanic, to trigger her primal survival instinct. She wouldn't risk waiting for the police. She would risk everything for that USB drive. I hated it. I hated the theatricality, the risk, the dark mirror of her own manipulation. But this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about the fact that she had tried to orchestrate his death for a stock portfolio. That evening, the Pacific Heights mansion, the very house she sold, now legally in limbo, was dark, silent, and felt enormous. We were inside the study, the scene of the codicil signing, the place where all the careful legal knots had been tied. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. My father sat in his restored leather chair, looking frail but ready, a loaded witness. We weren't alone. Outside, nestled deep in the shadows of the hedges, 2 plainclothes detectives were waiting. I had convinced Dad to allow the police involvement, not as first responders, but as silent, observing witnesses. "She'll come in through the back gate," Dad whispered. "She always hated the main driveway. Too public." The minutes stretched into an eternity of silence. Then a faint sound, the barely audible click of a lock being picked. The study door swung open. Veronica. She was no longer the polished socialite. Her hair was messy, her clothes dark and utilitarian. Her eyes, wide and darting, held a raw mixture of fear and intent. She had a small, heavy purse clutched in her hand. She didn't immediately see my father, hidden by the shadows near the large desk. Her gaze was fixed instantly on the desk itself, hunting for the mythical USB drive. "Looking for something, Ronnie?" My father's voice, a gravelly whisper, hit her like a physical blow. She spun around, gasping, her face contorted. Seeing him out of the coma, sitting upright, was the ultimate shock. You're awake," she stammered, the realization hitting her full force. "The codicil, the court, you knew." "I knew everything." "Veronica," Dad said, his voice slow and heavy with terminal judgment, "I knew you were greedy. I knew you were selfish. But even I, your father, didn't believe you'd try to tamper with my brakes." The statement was the match that lit the fuse. Her composure evaporated. "It was the only way. You were going to cut me out. You chose Cassandra, the pathetic artist, over me, the one who fought for your company." She took a frantic step toward him. "You forced my hand. You left me with nothing." You left yourself with nothing, Veronica, I interjected, stepping out of the shadows. I watched her eyes flick from me to Dad, a caged animal looking for an exit. Where is it? The drive, she shrieked, ignoring me. Her hand went into her purse. There is no drive, Ronnie, Dad stated, his voice ringing with finality. There is only your conscience, and the truth you just confessed. You committed attempted murder for the company I built. You crossed the line I set in stone 10 months ago. The financial ruin was the warning. The criminal investigation is the consequence. She lunged. Not for us, but for the telephone on the desk. Perhaps to smash it or call for help. A final, desperate attempt at control. You won't tell them, she screamed. You can't ruin your own daughter. You stop being my daughter the moment you risk my life for a ledger entry, Dad said, his eyes hard and dry. I reached out and grabbed her arm, preventing her from reaching the phone. She fought back with surprising, savage strength. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Police! Freeze! The two detectives, who had been waiting for the confession and the ensuing physical conflict, flooded the room. Veronica froze, mid-struggle, her face the ultimate portrait of a power fantasy gone fatally wrong. She looked at my father, then at me. Her final, defeated question, whispered with venom, was directed at me. You recorded this too? Every word, Ronnie, I confirmed, pointing subtly to a small device tucked beneath a stack of binders. The handcuffs clicked, loud, blunt, and undeniable. The gold of her bracelet clanging against the dull steel of the cuffs was the only sound for a moment. They led her away, the powerful, sophisticated CEO reduced to a common criminal, caught in the act. Dad and I sat in silence for a long time. The drama was over, the battle won. The law had provided the rope, but her own moral turpitude had provided the neck. It's done, Dad, I whispered. He leaned back, his energy spent. No, Cassie, justice is done. Now the healing begins. 6 months later, the Thorne family was irrevocably changed. Veronica faced charges of financial fraud, attempted aggravated assault, further brake tampering, and conspiracy. The plea deal was dismissed. She was facing a long sentence. My father made a full recovery. The company, stabilized by the court-appointed management, was now his again. But the experience had fundamentally shifted his perspective. I stood beside him on the newly tended lawn of the Pacific Heights estate. The house was no longer for sale. It was back in the trust, protected by an even tighter structure. I've signed the new papers, Cassie, Dad said, resting a hand on my shoulder. You are the new chairwoman of the board, not just because you deserve it, but because you possess the one quality Veronica always lacked, moral courage. And you've changed the codicil again? I asked, a slight knowing smile on my face. Oh, it's tighter than ever, he chuckled, the first genuine, unburdened laugh I'd heard in months. But the real change is in the definition of a core asset. It's no longer just the real estate or the company's IP. It now includes funding for the Alexander Thorne Foundation, your charity for young artists. I looked at the waves breaking softly on the distant shore, the same view that had marked the beginning of this nightmare. I didn't just save a house, Dad, I said, finally letting the full weight of the journey settle. I saved the integrity of the family name. The asset wasn't the $20 million. The asset was the truth. I took a deep breath, turning to face the future, the company, and the legacy that was now rightfully mine to shepherd. The quiet victory was the sweetest one of all. Thank you for following Cassandra's journey in the legal noose.